Good morning, it's Inside Tennessee. So you hear a lot about every 4 years the youth vote, and they're going to turn out because some candidate has really energized them. I got curious and looked at the precincts that are around the UT area where students might vote. Would be if they were voting here as opposed to absentee. Look at what you see. There's not a whole lot of variation in the presidential years, except for 2012 when Barack Obama was running for re-election. I guess nobody wanted to bother with that. So that kind of blows a hole in that myth. We can talk about that a little bit if you want. But let's talk surprise right now, and it's Don Bosch.
Well, I'm going to piggyback on what Susan said in the last block. The number of Democrats that have come out to vote, and Billy's right, a competitive election will do that, but even in Knoxville, while the presidential election draws the attention and everything, all but one of the competitive elections were on the Republican side. And I knew a number of Democrats that struggled and crossed over and voted in the Republican primary so they could vote for some of these local office holders that were important. You know, you can imagine, for example, and I'll go back to the public defender, that is largely populated by Democrats and progressives. And every one of those folks, and there's about 25 of them, or nearly everyone, crossed over, as did a lot of other lawyers, and voted in the Republican primary so they could vote for Eric Lutton. And so, but when you looked at it statewide, and John and you and I have been talking about that for about a week, statewide, nationwide, Democrats have come out and voted, and they are energized. They weren't energized in 2016 because Hillary Clinton didn't excite them. No. They're excited now. I think the other surprise would be Joe Biden winning Texas. No one thought, Billy brought it up early in the show, what was it, a 15-point swing in 8 days? In 8 days. Incredible comeback. And this election's not over, folks. Don't anoint Joe Biden yet. Things happen. Elections have cycles. But boy, I'd rather be Joe Biden than Bernie Sanders right now.
Susan?
Well, and speaking of Bernie Sanders, when we left election night, we thought Bernie had carried Knox County.
Yeah.
And as it turned
Talk
out,
about
it was
crazy.
about 100 votes difference, I think. And I think a lot of that was the early votes, came from the early votes because Bernie was sort of the guy in the early voting, and Biden looked like he was toast until South Carolina. So I do think that was a big part of it. But I mean, if Bernie Sanders had carried Knox County, I think there would have been some earthquakes rolling through.
The focus of the earth would have shifted.
It would have been.
What do you think, Billy?
I think one of the surprises is the Democratic Party nationally is not as liberal as many people have come to think it is. You look what happened in Iowa and New Hampshire, and we drew all these assumptions how it's really going over to the far left. When they went in the voting booth yesterday in 18 states, there were moderates voting. They were not leftist liberals, and that showed up in Minnesota and Maine and Massachusetts and Virginia and everywhere.
And even in a degree, California, with Joe Biden getting as close as he did to Bernie Sanders.
Is that the silent majority of the Democratic Party?
They're less loud than the other bloc, let me put it that way.
Anything else that surprised you?
Well, the myth of the youth vote, and we've talked about that a little bit, this notion that Bernie Sanders is somehow going to inspire some awakening and these massive new numbers of voters, it never happens. It's talked about with McGovern, it's talked about with Clinton, talked about with Obama. Those young people who voted for Sanders, but not in big numbers. Yeah. So that's a myth.
Well, what we'll do is I pledge to do this. Those were primary numbers. When we come to November, I will look at what November, but I believe you. I don't think we're going to see much of an impact. So. And Karen, what do you think?
I'm going to go back to local now, and District 5 County Commission seat surprised me. John Schoonmaker has done a great job. He's just a public servant in his office, and that race was close. And it was interesting because usually your early voting numbers kind of tell you what the story is going to be. Early voting, John was up 55 to 44%, and on election day, Clayton Wood was up 54 to 45. Now, John ended it, but it ended up to be a much closer race than I thought.
I predict that we'll see Clayton Wood's name again on some future ballots in Knox County. Maybe for that, because Schoonmaker will be assuming I don't think he has an opponent in the
no, he doesn't.
August, but we'll see Clayton Wood again. He was a good candidate and had a lot of support from a lot of the faith-based organizations in town. So I do think we'll see.
I think
him.
he probably got started in his campaign a
Little
little
bit
late.
late. Yeah.
And did you want to talk about District 4? Because that was
do.
interesting.
Yeah, that was the other local race where you had Kyle Ward, who was a newcomer, and Scott Broyles, who has been engaged in Republican politics for some time. We had them on our show. We thought they were both really good candidates. Scott is, I guess, a little more seasoned than Kyle, but Kyle had a great story. Military background, very new, but a big margin of victory there.
Thank you. All right, we're going to take another break, and then when we come back for our final block, we'll be looking ahead, maybe talking about turnout and what the rest of this year is going to look like. You're watching Inside Tennessee.